Welcome back, artists, to week 2 of our torn paper flowers collage. Today you're going to need the black and white sharpied hibiscus that we did in video 1. You're also going to need a glue stick and a bunch of scrap paper. So I have collected some leftover origami paper, some paper that came out of a fan that broke, construction paper, glitter paper. You might only have scraps of construction paper. If you have tissue paper, that can work too. It's a little harder to glue, but I'm going to show you how to do it. And you just need to have a pile of tissue paper and scraps of construction paper that we are going to use for our collage. And then, of course, the glue stick to put that on with. And then you're also going to need some crayons. If you don't have crayons, you can use colored pencils. I don't want you to use markers today, especially if you're using tissue paper, because it'll bleed onto the tissue paper. So I would stick with crayons or colored pencils, your glue stick, your scraps, and your drawing from last week. So press pause if you need to go collect any of those supplies. You'll notice that I did not say scissors, and that's because we are not going to be cutting any of this scrap paper. We're going to be tearing the paper. So I'm going to show you my technique, and then I'm going to move into fast forward mode because it is a little bit time consuming to tear your paper and glue it, and you don't need to see me do the entire collage, but I will show you the technique because there's one important thing I want to tell you about it. We are not going to fill the entire space of the flower with torn paper. We're actually just going to fill part of the flower, each section that is, with torn paper. And then we're going to color the space between the torn paper and the Sharpie. And I'm going to show you an example of what I mean. But the reason we're not going to use torn paper to cover the entire flower is because then the outline of the Sharpie disappears and you can't see your flower anymore. So here is what I'm talking about. Let's see. This is a good example here. Okay, so here's one that I finished last week, and you'll notice that I tore the paper so that it fits inside the Sharpied petals, inside the Sharpied leaves, even inside, for the most part, of these little pollen circles. And in some areas, I just use one torn piece of paper. In some other areas, I've chosen to use 2 or even 3. So it'll be up to you. This one, I did a few more than 3. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then back to 1 each in this section. The trick is you are not going to tear paper to cover the whole area because I don't want the Sharpie to disappear. The reason this looks cool is because you can see the outline of the flower in Sharpie, so it holds the shape of the hibiscus. And then you'll notice that in between the torn paper and the Sharpied outline, I chose a crayon color that matches the paper theme for that petal. If you're just using construction paper and you tear off a piece of green and you put it in the petal, then you would choose your green crayon to color the space between the torn paper and the Sharpie. So hopefully that makes sense. You're keeping everything the same theme. With this multicolored paper from my origami set, I saw that there was some purples in here, so I chose a purple crayon. Now, if you're like, well, I used blue tissue paper, but this is a leaf and I really want to color that space green, be my guest. That's your artistic choice. But I'm just giving you a suggestion that you could stay with the theme of the torn paper that you use, unless your heart is telling you you absolutely have to choose a different color. And that, I'm sure, will come out really cool too. Okay, so there's that first example. And I'm going to get started here and just show you how I go about doing it. So let's say I'm going to work with this peacock paper. It's kind of like my favorite. I'm going to start by tearing out a section, and I'm going to see how it fits. So let's say I want to go with this petal right here. And you'll notice that already it's overlapping outside of the Sharpie line. So I need to tear it off and I need to make it smaller. And then I can set it over to the side, and then I can see if it fits. I notice there's still a little piece here that needs to get torn off, and here. And like I said, this is a little time consuming to find the pieces that fit the shape that you're looking for. So that works for me. And then I might say, well, I'm gonna take this piece that I just tore off and I'm gonna put one more right here, just so I can fill in the space a little bit more. So that's gonna be for there. If you want to, you can add another little tear and put it here. But I'd say don't get too crazy because it takes a long time to do this. And again, you don't want to overlap over the Sharpie. So I'm going to leave that here for now. I'm going to glue in a second on fast mode so you can get a better idea of how I continue doing this. So then I pick out my next color scheme. And like I said, if you don't have origami paper, no big deal. You can use different colors of construction paper per petal if you wanted to do that. So like, for example, if you had green construction paper and yellow construction paper, you can tear off pieces of each and put it in the same petal, if that's something that sounds fun to you. So then I have a couple more pieces here that take up that petal. Notice there's a nice space to color in between the torn paper and the Sharpie outline. Let's say I want to use some tissue paper as a nice contrast of texture. So I've talked about texture before in my videos. You can fold tissue paper around itself to get it to fit easier. It'll also thicken up the paper so it's harder to tear it once you're gluing it down, because sometimes it can tear really easily when you're gluing because it's super, super thin. Okay, and there we go with that. And I'm gonna do one more. I have glitter paper and I'm gonna use some glitter paper here in the leaf. And I kind of think because the glitter paper would cover up all the Sharpie, I'm just gonna do strips of the glitter paper because that might be a cool way to show the lines of Sharpie in between, like that. Okay, so I'm gonna move into fast mode to finish up the tearing and the gluing. I think you got the idea of how I'm staying in between the Sharpie lines and not getting to fill up the whole space. All right, so you're gonna keep going. You're gonna keep putting torn paper down onto your hibiscus. I actually find it easier to glue and finish a section before I move on to the next, but I was just showing you how I tear. So that's what I'm gonna continue doing. Glue, move on, glue, move on. And then I will meet you back here for coloring in the space of the flower. Have fun. Okay, so now that we have our torn paper glued into the places that we'd like to have it, I actually let this dry for a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, just because when you start coloring in the space around the torn paper, you might have some leftover glue from your glue stick, and it's hard to get crayon or colored pencil in those areas. If your teacher wants to pause the video here and let these pieces dry overnight, you can always take another day to color in the rest of these last steps. So for me, I have some crayons here and I'm just gonna take them out next to me so I can choose my colors. And like I mentioned before, we're gonna pick colors that kind of go with the theme of the torn paper inside the petals and the leaves. So like for example here with my tissue paper, I'm gonna choose a blue and I'm gonna start coloring the blue from the tissue paper to the Sharpied edge of my petal, of my hibiscus. I'm gonna switch to fast mode here in a minute so you don't have to watch me color all this in, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how this turns out. You'll notice here that there's some glue that's not quite dry. So that's what happens. If it's not all the way dry, it'll resist the crayon. Sometimes it looks kind of cool. So if you want some places to be a little bit less dark, so right here is more glue that's not quite dry. So again, if you would like to have this project have a second step and you can let these dry, then that works too. Otherwise, you can just color around it like I'm doing now and it'll come out awesome. So that's for there. Then in this little area here, maybe I want to choose a red to kind of pick up the red in that origami paper. So I'm just coloring around. This is a reddish pink, it looks like, red violet. Wild strawberry is what it's called actually. and I'm just coloring around in these areas, filling in that space. So I'm gonna stop after this petal and then move into fast mode for the rest of the petals and the leaves. But I wanted to show you one more thing about the pollen molecules. So you'll notice that where I tore little pieces of paper for my pollen molecules, I did not do all of them. I left some of them without paper on them. And that's because I think it's a nice contrast to have some of the pollen molecules have the torn paper and some of them be crayon. So that is an artistic decision that's up to you. So for example, I'm gonna color in these last few circles so they're perfectly inside the lines, and then that'll pick up, actually I put some glue on that one so it's hard to color it in. There we go. So that will pick up also the same theme of pinks for my pollens right here. And then I might choose a color that goes well with pink that's bright, maybe this kind of green yellow, and color in this area around the pollen. So go ahead, keep watching. I'm gonna switch into fast mode here, finish up the video showing you how to fill in the space of our torn paper and our Sharpie, and then we will be finished with this masterpiece. One last thing, it's up to you if you would like to color the background. I personally like to keep the background white because the flower is so busy that you don't necessarily need a background color. But if your heart is telling you that you do, then I would recommend using something very neutral, like a gray or even like a tan, something light, because this is so bright and busy. So that will be up to you if you choose to color your background. And if you do, it could just be in a light shading technique. All right, here we go, fast mode.